Hello, I'm Andy Agathangelo. I'm very proud to be the founder of campaign group Transparency Task Force. We are a certified social enterprise. We operate as a not-for-profit. We're on a trajectory towards becoming a charity, more about that in due course. And we basically exist to be a champion for the consumer. We think consumers in the financial sector are, frankly, being let down by all kinds of bodies that are there to protect their interests. Sometimes they do a great job, sometimes they don't. And we've taken upon ourselves the role of trying to identify when the regulatory framework isn't working well and to provide constructive comment and criticism when that is the case, so that we can basically get the regulators to be as effective as possible. In very, very broad terms, the way that we see it is that there's a bit of a tension between regulators doing what they're supposed to do to protect consumers and regulators being influenced by the companies that they regulate, many of whom, like the banks, for example, have huge budgets for lobbying and have huge capability to influence. And that tension between the regulators trying to protect consumers and the regulated entities pushing back, wanting as much freedom to make money as they wish to, is an almost natural tension. It's always going to be there in one way or another. But given the fact that we are a parliamentary democracy, there are all kinds of checks and balances in our system that are meant to keep everything under control, keep it all sensible, keep it all operating reasonably effectively. And when those checks and balances do function well, everything's tickety-boo, but they don't always function well. So much so that some people, including people on tonight's session, are of the very, very strong view that there's something going woefully wrong with the hierarchy of oversight over and above our regulators. Now, whilst it's easy to argue that this is not just an issue for financial services, think, for example, about the regulators supposedly governing the water industry. Think of all that horrible stuff we get to hear about on our TV screens every now and then about rivers being polluted, lakes, ponds, seas being polluted. That's obviously due to some massive catastrophic regulatory failure. So it's not just the financial sector where things go horribly, horribly wrong. It happens elsewhere as well. Tonight's session with Dr. Matthew Gill gives us an opportunity to hear about the report that the Institute of Government produced back in, I think it was September last year. As soon as Transparency Task Force became aware of the report, we were instantly interested in it because it's all about getting parliamentary committees to improve their oversight of regulators. So very, very relevant. We fixed up a conversation with Matthew, who very, very kindly agreed to spend some time on this Tuesday evening talking to us about his report. And as Matthew and I have discussed over the last 24 hours or so, there is so much happening in the space right now that makes his report and his institute's report even more topical than it was when it was hot off the press back in September. I do hope that sets the scene. What I'm hoping for myself personally tonight is a better understanding of what could and should parliamentary committees do to hold regulators to account. That's really what it's all about. Thank you all for being here. Thank you in particular, of course, to Dr. Matthew Gill. Can we kick off by showing our appreciation for Matthew for writing the report and taking time to present it to us tonight and sharing his thoughts about it. Once Matthew's covered the ground he wants to cover, we'll go into Q&A and discussion and take the conversation where you folks wanted to go. Thank you very much indeed. Dr. Matthew Gill, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, for that introduction. That's very kind, and it's very good to be on the call and to meet you all. So I'm going to start really by giving an overview of this piece of research that we did, but then very happy to get into a much broader conversation afterwards if people would like that. So in the context, I guess, for this report right now is the announcement yesterday of a series of measures that government wants to take to align regulation and growth. The context when we wrote it was a series of reports, including most immediately before ours from the Industry and Regulators Committee on who watches the watchdogs of sort of people looking at the way in which regulators are overseen and being worried about whether that was adequate and how to do it better. So, and you can look in various directions at this sort of oversight matrix. But what we decided to do was to look very specifically at the role of Parliament and to try and start from some data about what oversight Parliament actually does carry out at the moment. And so some of the starting point of the research I'm going to talk about is that we counted the number of select committee hearings that regulators were at, the type of committee hearing they were at during the last Parliament, and looked at what kind of scrutiny they received in that context. Now, of course, there is more to it than an oral evidence session in Parliament, but there's still quite a significant oral culture in Parliament. And so we thought that gives you a pretty good insight into how seriously the issues are being taken in Parliament, given the way that Parliament works. We focused on not every committee in Parliament, about 30 select committees, so all the departmental committees, and then some cross-cutting committees that look a lot at regulation, like the PAC, Speakers Committees, and some Lords Committees focusing on regulation, like the Industry and Regulators Committee. And we went through and compiled this information. But it's interesting that in order to do that, we first had to compile a list of UK statutory regulators in the first place, because such a list did not exist. And so we defined those organisations as an individual or body granted statutory powers by the UK Parliament, ministers or the monarch to set standards, monitor performance or compliance, or take enforcement action. That's a reasonably broad definition. It includes some inspectorates, which some people don't count as regulators. And we came up with 116 of those. Of course, that doesn't include devolved bodies or local bodies. It doesn't include self-regulation. It only includes those with some mandate from the UK Parliament. But there's quite a number of bodies in there. And so, as I say, we wanted to focus specifically on the unique role of Parliament, and Parliament is just one, if the supreme cog in a system of regulatory oversight. Ministers and departments have a very important role in overseeing regulators, as does the National Audit Office, as ultimately does the judicial system, as well as those who interact with regulators, regulated entities, individuals, stakeholders, media, and so on. So there's quite a big sort of network here, at which Parliament is at the apex. So I think the takeaway from this is that it's key for Parliament not to duplicate scrutiny that's happening elsewhere, particularly given the limited bandwidth that Parliament has. And it's important to try and streamline the steers that are being given to regulators so that they have a clear view of what it is that they are supposed to be doing. Because as you can see from this, they're responding to quite a lot of different influences. So to get onto the numbers that we found, this chart shows you that of the 116 regulators that we identified, almost a third of them were not called to give an oral evidence session at all in the last Parliament. So that runs from December 2019 up to, I mean, our report data cutoff was the end of March last year. So there was a couple of months left of the Parliament that we don't capture. So there's I'm using that as a slight shorthand, but the end of the data is the end of March. So about a third of them weren't seen at all. And then almost more than a third were seen, but were not seen for a general scrutiny session. So there wasn't a general conversation about what are your objectives, how are you intending to achieve them, what's your sort of plan for the future. It might be, for instance, a reactive session about something that's gone wrong, and they were called in on a one-off basis. But that leaves less than a third of regulators who were actually called during the last Parliament for a forward-looking general scrutiny session about what they were doing and how well they were performing. So that gives you a view of who was seen, but what it doesn't show you is how differently distributed that was across different regulators. So this chart is really interesting because you can see that Parliament, in proportion to its other work, actually has quite a significant focus on financial services. The FCA was seen 36 times during the period that we looked at, so more even than the NAO itself. The PRA also features pretty high up that list, alongside the utilities regulators and some of the environmental regulators. But that chart only covers the top sort of few regulators, really. Remember, there are 116 that disappear off to the right of this chart, and it quickly tends towards some very low numbers in terms of when people were seen. So, for instance, the Food Standards Agency was only seen 3 times, and the Office for Nuclear Regulation just twice. There's also a big variation, as this chart shows, between how often the regulator's accountable between committees, as it were. So what this chart shows is above the gap there are the committees to which regulators report directly. The ones below are committees that don't have regulators reporting to them directly, but who have an interest. So if you look at the ones above, for instance, the Health and Social Care Committee at the top, we're saying that they have the most regulators accountable to them. But as you can see, they only have a middling number of oral evidence sessions. And actually, I don't think there are any general scrutiny sessions for health and social care in the last Parliament. The Treasury Select Committee, by contrast, has, I think, 5 regulators accountable to it, but has done far more oral evidence sessions than anybody else. And some of the non-departmental committees are really quite important. So like the Environmental Audit Committee, Public Accounts Committee, the Lords Industry and Regulators Committee at the bottom do quite a bit of scrutiny work that's outside of that kind of direct line management responsibility for regulators, if you like. So to expand on that data, we've just taken those select committees in the top part of that chart, which is the ones which have a direct responsibility for oversight, and said, well, okay, when was the last time that they saw each of the regulators that are responsible to them? And so these are the numbers. So if you look at again, the health and social care on the top line, what that's saying to you is that the 8 regulators in red there, that's 8 regulators that they didn't see at all in the last Parliament, but which are responsible to them. They saw 1 in 2020, 2 in 2020, so 3 in 2023, and 2 in 2024. Again, so levelling up housing and communities didn't see many. The Treasury has seen everybody in the last Parliament. So you can see there's a real distribution in terms of how many people have been seen. Now, if we go from that question of when they were last seen at all to when they were last seen for a general scrutiny session looking at what they're doing and how well they're performing, it looks a lot worse. And that's the chart for that question. I should say we assumed here that inquiries are reactive and so are not performing that proactive scrutiny session, and we've excluded pre-appointment hearing from this data. If we'd taken different decisions on the data, it would have looked better than this, but not massively better than this. What I think you can take away is that a clear majority of regulators are not being examined by Parliament in a meaningful way on their statutory setup and performance across the breadth of their responsibilities, at least in the last Parliament. So those are our findings purely on the numbers. But what we also did was to interview people and hold roundtables and discussions about this subject to try and see what the experience of scrutiny is in Parliament when it actually happens. And this slide gives you some quotes. We spoke to current and former parliamentarians, parliamentary staff, civil servants, and also regulators. and I should say, we found some examples of really good practice in select committee scrutiny. It's very important not to take away from this that there's nothing good going on out there, very much the contrary. And where select committees can be really effective is, for instance, in actually the obligation that regulators have to prepare for the select committee hearing. They can be make or break moments for regulatory careers. And regulators will go through a process of, as one person described it to us, pulling up the dead bodies to try and work out what's been happening before they go into the hearing, because they know they'll be asked about it. The hearings can also be an important opportunity to influence the government through Parliament. So if there are recommendations that come out for changes in legislation or funding for different programs, that can put pressure on the government to solve problems. And whilst we've sort of emphasised the importance of proactive scrutiny in this research, it is important also for Parliament to look at when things have gone wrong. And so that kind of reactive response to a public interest in a failure can flag up and bring to the fore certain lessons learned. Although we did hear a number of regulators sort of saying to us that actually by the time you get to that kind of hearing, it's rare that something comes up that you weren't already aware of as an issue in the process. All of that said, these quotes do give you a flavour of how it can often feel to people that there's quite a kind of a sort of not aggressive exactly, but a line of questioning that might be happening with a view to the soundbite. And then that leads to defensive answers that people are giving because they're very conscious that this is happening in public. Sometimes the follow-up isn't as good as it could be. So you'll have the conversation in the hearing, but then the committee won't necessarily follow up afterwards. And so next time the regulator's in, there's no continuity between the questions are being asked and how the conversation is going on. And often the discussion can be backward looking, what's already happened, rather than forward looking about how things can be made better. So our recommendations to try and address this situation are well, we have many recommendations, and this slide is an attempt to simplify them down into a short list. I think the first thing that we have to do is just be really clear what it is that we're expecting of Parliament. And so that means clarity about committee responsibilities. There's a document called the Core Tasks for Select Committees, which used to give them a responsibility for the oversight of public bodies and regulators. And it was abbreviated a few years ago just to make it more compact. And that language, I think, was reduced to public bodies. So the mention of regulators and regulation is not explicit in the core tasks anymore, which means that some committees are not even certain that it is their responsibility. So clarifying there that it is a responsibility would be really helpful. I think the government, after we'd published our report, did also publish a list of public bodies, at least in the economic sphere, regulators, sorry, but we think government should be more systematically publishing a list of the regulators that exist and which parts of Parliament they interface with, because that's a necessary starting point to scrutinising them effectively. We think that Parliament itself should be focusing on the key areas where it can be influential. And that's important given the very limited bandwidth that Parliament has to spend time on this. And so where it should be focusing is on the legislative basis and the objectives of the regulators. What are they set up to achieve? And how do those remits overlap, duplicate, miss things that are important? So that they're mapping that terrain and happy that they've actually set up a regulatory architecture that does what needs to be done. They should also be looking at the regulators' relationships with government and Parliament. Is the oversight being performed by government appropriate? Are the right bits of Parliament engaged when regulators come to see them? I mean, one of the reasons, for instance, the Office for Nuclear Regulation is, I don't think, seen very often, is because it actually I think for reasons of conflict of interest, feeds into the DWP Select Committee. And obviously the DWP Select Committee is not particularly interested in nuclear regulation. And so, but there's nobody who's tasked with working out, well, who should be calling them then and engaging in that. So that needs working out. And also, there is an important role for Parliament in reflecting the public interest as received by direct from constituents, and being able to kind of leapfrog that straight into a conversation with regulators and with government. But we think that Parliament needs to focus on those functions and then delegate other functions of audit and oversight to other parts of government, but satisfy itself that those other parts of government or other agents are doing that job well, because Parliament hasn't got the capacity to do it itself. And we think that, given the statistics we've put up, for Parliament to say that it will have a forward-looking scrutiny session with each regulator once per Parliament is a kind of minimum that it should either meet or explain why not, case by case. I think, as well as just conducting the scrutiny and conducting the scrutiny in the right area, Parliament needs to be equipped to ask the right questions and conduct effective scrutiny. And this is where we found that the support provided to parliamentary committees is good, but it's limited in bandwidth. And often they don't have access to experts in regulation when they are trying to hold regulators to account. And so it seemed to us not that you would want to duplicate expertise in the precise regulatory detail that each regulator is engaged in the select committee that oversees that regulator, but you would at least want a secretariat resource in Parliament that has experience of regulators, knows how to probe a regulator's business plan and objectives, what questions to ask about what might have gone wrong, to help parliamentarians formulate their questions and maintain a sustained oversight of those regulators over time. So we propose that a support unit should be established in Parliament to serve both houses, probably with just a handful of staff, but people who are expert in these issues and can help support committees when they have specialist hearings on this subject. And we also think that the NAO should have a more significant role. And first of all, there should be a conversation between the NAO and parliamentarians about how it can better support them to hold regulators to account. But if that isn't sufficiently forthcoming, then Parliament could consider changing the duties or objectives of the NAO to ensure that it provides more support here. I mean, I think the counterfactual that was going around when we wrote this report was possibly setting up a whole new sort of regulator of regulators, if you like, to do some of this oversight. And when we looked at that proposal, our view was that actually you were setting up something which looked so much like the NAO that it might as well be part of the NAO. And also that there are significant risks to setting up a new organization, because you've got to find the right leadership to establish its reputation. It might try and focus on some hot button topics, which might exactly be the stuff that's already over scrutinized, rather than looking at where the gaps are. And so it would make more sense to use the existing infrastructure that's available, but build it out to provide this support. What we also did in our report was sort of put together some more sort of detailed best practice on how regulators how parliamentary committees might run their evidence sessions and help to sort of scrutinise regulators. And we've been working on providing sort of support to parliamentary staff internally to help them to do that. And that includes, as I've said, sort of questioning regulators about their sort of future strategy and plans, because the people responsible for that, senior leaders, are usually the people who are in front of those committees. So I'll stop there. That gives you an idea of what we've done, and we can talk about that or about other things. I mean, I should say the announcement yesterday morning about regulation and growth was very much focused on tackling the burden of regulation, reducing uncertainty across the regulatory system, so refining the duties and roles that regulators have, and also avoiding sort of risk aversion in the system. So I guess from that perspective, that is likely to inform the kind of scrutiny, at least from the government side, that they will want Parliament to be providing through these sessions. So something we might want to discuss is whether that's the right focus, or whether there are other things they should be looking at. But thank you for listening, and very happy to discuss any of that or anything else.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Folks, I've put a link to the report Matthew's been speaking about in the chat. Please do take time to take a proper look at it, because it's a very well thought through piece of work, completely evidence-based, very, if you like, scientific in its approach, very balanced, without an agenda, just describing the realities of the situation in good quantitative and qualitative terms. So Matthew, thank you very much indeed for what you've done. That, in all honesty, there's so much of massive interest to me and this community around this topic that I could hold you all night, but I promise I won't. A few thoughts come to my mind, though, based largely on the committees that are of particular interest to this community, which would be the Treasury Committee, the Working Pensions Committee, the Lords Financial Regulators Committee. They're probably the most important ones. And like I'm sure other people in this session, I spend time reading the transcripts of the meetings and or watching it on Parliament TV, sometimes live, more typically after the event. And one of the thoughts that comes to my mind time and time again is that, and this is not meant to be critical of the individuals themselves, but you are almost itching for the committee members to take the questioning in a particular direction, or you are hearing the regulator give a response to the question that may be factually correct, but is so incomplete that it's virtually meaningless or even arguably misleading. And you're saying to yourself, if only the committee members knew more about the topic. Now, forgive me, this is not me being egotistically driven about the fact that we know a lot about this stuff, but do the committee members necessarily have the depth of knowledge and experience that you would really want them to have? Did your report do anything to try to assess that? It's a really significant point for us, Matthew, because time and time again, we feel as though the regulators are not being sufficiently quizzed and challenged, because the people quizzing and challenging them don't have the depth of knowledge to know when they're being given an answer that's actually pretty superficial. I hope I've explained that okay in reasonably polite terms about the challenge that I see here.
Yeah, no, I fully understand the point. I think the only answer I can give to that is that it is extremely variable. Parliamentarians come in with different backgrounds and professional histories, and actually some of them who have a background in a particular industry can be very good at holding regulators in that industry to account. But that's inevitably the exception, given the number of regulators there are and the complexity of what they do. So as a general rule, you're not, you can't expect parliamentarians to have a detailed technical knowledge of the area of regulation that they're scrutinizing at that time. And so that, I think, is why I put such emphasis on the importance of some degree of specialist expertise in the Secretariat to be able to support them in putting that the lines of questioning together. And I think I'd argue that there is you can have a technique to scrutinizing a regulator that doesn't necessarily require to have deep specialist knowledge of everything that regulator does. So you can ask them about, what their regulatory strategy is. Are they rules based or principles based? Why do they think that's appropriate to what they're doing? How are they using resources? What's their balance between enforcement and gentle persuasion of a regulator of somebody to do the right thing? What are the key risks that they see coming down the line, and how are they going to mitigate them? Have they spoken to other regulators or areas of expertise, areas of regulatory expertise that might be adjacent to theirs but relevant? And certainly, if you look at water or energy, if conversations with prudential or regulators had happened alongside the economic regulation of those sectors at an earlier stage, some of the problems there might have been averted. So looking at the join up there. But some of those kinds of lines of questioning that I've just described, those are generic. You don't have to have a specific knowledge of financial services to want to understand how regulators are operating on those dimensions. So I think there's work to do to support committees to do that effectively. And I think even stepping back from regulatory scrutiny, there's something about doing scrutiny in general well, which could be improved. And the kinds of things that are relevant there is kind of just to narrow down the scope of what a committee tries to achieve in a single hearing, because often it could be quite scattergun. They'll try and cover a very large number of topics, and it's better to focus on a few topics and to agree to kind of go around them in a little bit more detail. Now, what the clerks will say is, well, yes, that is what happens, or at least that's what's supposed to happen before the session starts. But then, in reality, members don't necessarily go in the directions that had previously been thought. Also important to look at following up after sessions. So if the regulators talk about something, then follow up 3 months later, 6 months later. What have they done? Call them back in. But when you see them next time, talk to them again about the same stuff as you talked about before, to just see if they've moved things along. Understand the nature of their independence. Sometimes regulators operate within a legislative framework or a degree of independence that means that actually they have to make decisions in a certain way, or they're not accountable to Parliament in a certain way for some aspects of their decisions. And that might be perfectly legitimate, but you have to accept that or change it. You can't just complain that it's really unfortunate and that the regulator isn't doing what you want them to do. And I think it would be helpful as well for committees to evaluate their own work, to look back at, well, has our scrutiny over time of the regulators responsible to us delivered the outcomes we want? If not, why not? And how can we improve? And some of that happens, but more could.
Thank you. Thank you. I see we've got some other hands up, so we'll go to Philip and Ian in just a moment. But there's one more specific point. We're always looking for conflict of interest issues. And if you were to ask me, Andy, what's the most concerning thing you've come across as far as select committees are concerned, it would probably be this, Matthew. And I think this is a definite problem. It's when the entity being scrutinized provides staff on a secondary basis to the committee that is scrutinizing them. So, for example, we are pretty sure that there have been, it's plural, there have been FCA employees still on the FCA payroll doing work as a clerk in the Treasury Committee. And that just doesn't feel right. The optics aren't right. Even if it's being done meticulously well, the very fact that it's happening suggests to me that somebody somewhere is being overly generous with the idea that this can be going on without there being some kind of inappropriate influence. I'm not saying anything's happened that's wrong. I'm saying it creates the perception that there could easily be something wrong. What if that person is influencing the committee's work in such a way to defang the effective scrutiny of that committee on the regulator that they're working for? So when we came across evidence supporting this fact that there are FCA secondees on, for example, the Treasury Committee, we were quite alarmed about it. Didn't know what we could do about it, but it was quite alarming to us. I'm not going to hold you to it, but would you generally agree with me that the idea of regulators providing staff on a secondee basis to committees that are scrutinising them doesn't, in general terms, look too good from an optics point of view?
I can certainly see the optics on that. I think, however, I can also see how useful somebody seconded from the FCA would be to the Treasury Select Committee, trying to understand what's going on in that sector and know how to scrutinise it. So that's the tension. I guess the middle ground there would be to try and say, can they be seconded in to support the TSC, but somehow ring fenced from the specifics of scrutiny of the FCA so that they are less or not at all involved in preparing for the specifics of those sessions, whilst providing some general background. I mean, there's a wider issue here about sort of, revolving doors and interpollination of people in government agencies, and it's a real problem that the people who know enough to really ask the right questions are often involved in the work. So I totally see the point, but I don't think there's an easy answer, because if you say we don't want anybody from the regulators involved in the scrutiny process at all, it can be difficult for anybody external to know where to look.
Absolutely understood. Matthew, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. We're going to go to Mr. Philip Meadowcross, who's going to be chipping up the conversation. Philip, over to you, sir. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I've made more notes in the last half an hour than I have on any other previous session. So forgive me, I've got a number of random thoughts here. I've been present quite a number of times in Portcullis House at Treasury Select Committee hearings. And I have good memories of seeing Hector Sants and Andrew Bailey grilled, in fact, thoroughly barbecued at times. And that has been because, and this is where I think the select committees absolutely need top characters as their chairman. And we have seen people like Meg Hillier and Margaret Hodge and John McFall and Andrew Tyree being real pillars of strength in the interrogation of the people brought before the hearing. And referring to what you've mentioned a number of times already, we try to not be rude on this session, but let's say appallingly weak interrogational skills of many of the members, which have let off those people appearing in front of the committee. At one stage, I found that the deputy chairman of the Treasury Select Committee, in one period, openly told me that he did not feel it was the committee's function to examine whether a financial institution was acting fairly towards its customers. I found that an astonishing revelation from a senior MP and in fact a cabinet member to say such in front of me and in front of his chairman. What else did I note here? Is there a strong case, Matthew, for combining the talents of the House of Lords with the House of Commons in joint select committees? I think there are one or two, but I see that there seems to be a duplication of activity between House of Lords and House of Commons. And would we be able to bring some of the talents that are in the House of Lords who are not there representing particular constituents and playing to a constituency gallery in their questions? I leave that with you.
Lots of good thoughts there. Let's pass to Matthew to pick up on what you've covered so far. You've covered several pretty interesting areas, Philip. And if I could just chip in on one point before we go to Matthew, which is the Lords Financial Services Regulations Committee came about because of the last Financial Services and Markets Act, if I remember rightly. And the original conversation was about there being a combined Lords and Commons committee working together. But for reasons I don't really understand, it became a just a Lords one. But thank you, Philip. Matthew, to respond to anything you like to and what Philip's covered so far, then we'll go back to Philip for anything else on his shopping list of things to raise. Thank you, Matthew.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think on the interrogation skills of members, I agree. Some are great, some are less great. The only answer I can give you is training, and there's something I guess there about obviously members are democratically elected, and so it can be more difficult in that context to see their role as a job that requires skills and professional development, if you like. But I think in this context where how well they interrogate and hold to account really matters, then members being open to being trained on that and sort of knowing what they don't know, if you like, is really important. On the comment about somebody saying it wasn't their role to assess whether regulators are acting fairly, well, it might not be their role to arbitrate on an individual complaint, but it should be their role to see whether the system is ensuring that that assessment is being done properly, and if whether the overall outcomes in general are acceptable. And if they're not, then they need to change it. So I could understand that only as a reluctance to opine on a specific issue, but as a general area of concern, then of course they should be concerned if a regulator is acting unfairly. Combining the Lords and the Commons, the slight complication with that is that the funding sort of the evaluation of departmental funding and therefore ultimately regulator funding as well goes through the departmental select committees in the Commons. So they have there's a direct line of accountability on budgets from regulators through to the Commons committees. And it's difficult to those won't sit kind of jointly with the Lords per se. But what we do recommend in our report is that where, for instance, the Lords Industry and Regulation Committee is scrutinising a regulator, they should invite members of the relevant Commons Committee to that, and they should look at whether that can be used as a general sort of scrutiny session for the Commons Committee as well. So in substance, yes, but there are a couple of procedural reasons why a joint committee as such, rather than what a committee in one house which invites members from the others, is a little bit more difficult.
Thank you, Matthew. I recall I first met Mr. Athinganglu at a financial conduct authority annual public meeting about 10 or 12 years ago, Andy. Was that right?
Yeah.
That's where we first met. And that was the FCA's attempt to present itself to the public. I've wondered and scratched my head for a long time. So who does the FCA actually report to? And I've come to the conclusion by putting the odd thread here and there that it actually reports to the Treasury Select Committee, except that the Treasury Select Committee hasn't any executive function to clout the FCA with. Now, that seems to me to be a fundamental weakness in the structure of that kind of regulatory position. The FCA is dragged fairly frequently before the TSC. The TSC can tell them what it thinks of them, and sometimes it can be complimentary and well-deserved. But when it is the other way around, the TSC does not seem to have any kind of hammer with which to inflict any blows. Am I right?
Usually regulators would have an accountability both to Parliament directly and to ministers as well. I don't know precisely what the TSC's powers over the detail of how those powers will be exercised. So whether they would be able to force the FCA to do something or not. I think what they definitely can do is make recommendations to which the government and the regulator then has to respond, and accept or reject and give reasons why. But I'm not sure actually what the kind of in extremis sort of measure on that was. The government certainly could look at the regulator and could change its duties, could propose new legislation to change its powers. The leadership obviously are ultimately political appointees and can be removed. So I think a key thing that the TSC also does is put pressure on the government to exercise its oversight function and powers to change things at the regulator if it wants to. But a lot of those levers are more directly with the governments. And then for parliaments, it would be more at the point of where you're changing legislation. But it's slightly beyond my knowledge to know exactly what other levers Parliament can pull directly.
Can I just ask one final point, Andy, about the Secretariat? I have found them to be almost on all occasions utterly helpful. As a member of the public, you can inflict yourself on the chairman by putting towards him questions that you want to raise, usually through the offices of your MP. And if you've got a good MP who's got a decent relationship with the chairman of the TSC, and you can get that done. And we have achieved one or two useful things in that way. I think their accessibility is first rate, and I was aware of the FCA link with the Secretariat, but it has not impacted negatively on anything I've been involved with, and I give them credit for the follow-up and the enthusiasm of that team. Thank you very much, and sorry I've taken so much time.
I think all the points you raised, Philip, were very interesting. There's one particular matter, if I may, folks, I'll go back to, which is that general issue of how much control and influence does an entity have over a regulator? Because I think that takes us into a very, very interesting area, this tension between hoping that the regulator is sufficiently independent of government, but also making it sufficiently accountable. I'm going to share my screen, if I may, just to bring a particular point to life. So what you're looking at here, folks, is an article. It's quite old. It's January last year. But I found it to be a very, very interesting article. It's basically about this. It's about the post office scandal. Labour MP calls for arm's length body review to avoid future post office scandal. I'll put a link to it in the chat. What it basically says is Kevin Jones, now Lord Beamish, is basically saying, you know what, this post office scandal is bleeding awful, and we need a mechanism whereby when things are going wrong in an arm's length body, and regulators may or may not be an arm's length body, when things are going wrong, there needs to be a mechanism through which government can actually intervene and use its power and its might to actually grab something by the scruff of the throat and actually sort it out. And he's basically arguing in this article that if that had been available, then the post office scandal would probably not have been as significant as it has been. I'll put that link to that article in the chat for anybody that wants to take a look at it. TTF is likely to be running an event in get arm's length bodies to operate more effectively. We will come back to that point in due course. Philip, thank you. Matthew, thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Ian Tyler. Ian, to you. Thank you.
I'll keep it fairly short, but just on that last point, if you ever write to the Treasury Minister to point out a particular egregious failure by the FCA on a particular matter, you invariably get a response from the Treasury saying the FCA is operationally independent and Treasury, basically washes their hands of the matter. So I think technically the FCA isn't accountable. Obviously, in practice, there's a bit of a UK fudge in that, you know, if some head of the FCA was to really make himself unpopular with government ministers, I'm sure they'd be asked to leave, if you see what I mean. So, but I don't think there are any formal powers as such. I mean, it's a bit like the Bank of England governor. He's got, you know, you're not really able to sack him. He's been set up to be an independent central bank, and the PRA is part of the bank, and the FCA is sort of a subsidiary of the bank. So they're meant to be fairly independent, and thus actually the select committee is almost the only form of accountability that does exist. And I haven't got too many points to make, really, because I think some of them have already been made. I mean, clearly you're right that some form of accountability can be done just by people who ask good questions. But then there are a subset of issues, maybe even a majority, that come to this committee where the matter is quite technical. You know, you cannot get away from the fact that financial services is both quite complex. You know, financial instruments can be complex. Banking regulation is complex, and so and it is quite clear just from the few occasions I've attended committees that the questions asked vary quite considerably. You know, some of them are reasonably good questions, others are very poor, but perhaps even more worrying, I think, their ability to actually understand when they've been given shall we say, a bit of a pass, a push away answer. Their ability to actually understand the answers they've been given. You know, somebody, if you want to actually get to the meat of a subject, if someone is actually giving you a half answer, that's when you need to ask the really probing question. That's where you can make good progress. And that, to be honest, I haven't really seen it happen for quite a long while at the Treasury Select Committee. And that's made worse by, you know, the bankers or whoever's or the FCA, whoever's being questioned. They make certain promises about things, but it's very rare that you actually see any substantive follow-up, which we've had to, you know, comment on already. So yeah, I mean, and Andy's brought up the issue that certainly at times the Secretariat, whilst they have some competence, it's not obvious that they brief them to ask the really difficult questions, if you know what I mean. So that's why I think some of us think they have been they're quite careful in the way that they brief the members on the questions they ask. So it's all done in a very nice way. So it's very, very rare that there's ever any blood on the carpet, when actually the truth should be that some of these regulators should be really probed, because this is the only opportunity that exists to give them accountability. If you're in any other job, you've got shareholders, you've got employee, you've got customers, you've got all these different stakeholders that give you a hard time. In the FCA, you get a gentle question from an MP, and if you as long as you smile and sort of say, yeah, we'll do our best, you can sort of go away and come back again in 3 months' time. That's it. It's not really that's all I've got to say. Yeah.
Ian, thank you very much. Matthew, do you want to respond to some of those comments? Thank you, Matthew.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that, you know, I can absolutely see that perspective on it. I can also promise you that if the FCA were here, they would say that they feel very heavily scrutinised, that they're in front of Parliament all the time, and that if you go back to that sort of chart that I put up at the beginning of my presentation, there are all sorts of other sources of accountability around them that they feel quite keenly. So the challenge is not in a way more oversight. It's oversight that really gets to the point and being clear about who's able to change what. I think some of what you were saying, Ian, as well, about the oversight that departments have is quite important, because a regulator that's operationally independent, you know, will have certain decisions that it makes separately from the department. And in a way, the whole point of that is that the department can't remake those decisions. And in some cases that's really important. You wouldn't want ministers making decisions on who gets health treatment, or whether a police complaint's appropriate, or what have you. You need that separation. But it goes along with that when something goes wrong, the department can't necessarily fix that particular case. But what it can do, or should be able to do, is look at that case and say, is that symptomatic of the regulator having the wrong powers and duties and firing off in entirely the wrong direction? Is it symptomatic that they're not using their resources appropriately? And on those wider questions, the department can change things either immediately or through changing the legislation if it's more cumbersome than that. So it's a question of, I guess, when something like that happens, going to the department for that kind of change, and I guess for redress or correction of the individual issue, the route would be, and it's different in each industry, but it would be the ombuds who would take that on, and then there's a function that MPs perform in being a kind of backstop when even that doesn't work, to try and get things escalated. But once you're at a position where you've got to go to Parliament to get an individual complaint dealt with properly, something's gone very, very wrong in the system. It should never get to that point, ideally. And so you're already in a situation that's not, if you like, designed to happen.
Yeah, no, I think what you say there is fair. I mean, clearly there are a lot of people who have precisely that experience of, finding that the only possible route to getting any form of redress is with the help of their MP and things. And MPs do question the regulator, but I've also seen fairly frequently the regulator's letters back to MPs are highly misleading, and it's very, very hard, keeping the regulator accountable, actually, is my experience. Yeah. But I'll let someone speak. Yeah.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you very much, Matthew, Andy, and that's great input. We're going to go to Barry. Barry, please share your thought. Thank you, Barry.
Right. Yes, thank you, Andy. 3 questions for Matthew, perhaps. Are select committees reactive or proactive in how they proceed? How do we measure the success of a regulator? It is the number of times that they're being scrutinized. Is that a degree of that they are being successful, or is it a sign of failure? And the third question is about consumer protection. How can we have a regulator that really does put consumer protection first when the CEO is from within the industry and is rewarded within the industry after they finish their term?
Thank you. So, I mean, to take those in turn, are select committees reactive or proactive? They are both. But I guess the research that I've put in front of you suggests that there is a tendency towards reactivity. So something happens in the news or becomes a key concern for constituents, or something goes badly wrong, and then there will be greater attention. And that's partly driven by public interest. But there's also a proactive component, and I guess what I'm proposing is that should be strengthened and made as consistent as possible in regulatory oversight. How do we measure success of a regulator? Well, formally, you measure success by looking at how well they've met their statutory objectives. And so that should be set out in their annual report or other information they provide. But and I say that not as a kind of an evasive answer, that they are creatures of statute. And so what they can and can't do, and how they feel able to act, will be determined by the legislation and by the objectives that they have, and they will work back to that. So what government should be doing is saying, and Parliament saying, well, number one, are you meeting your objectives? 2, have you got a realistic plan in place to meet your objectives better going forward? But 3, are your objectives the right ones? And if they're not, how would we change them? And so it's not, you know, and that has to be a kind of constructive conversation about how the objectives should be different, rather than just lamenting, sometimes, as sometimes happens, that an organization that doesn't have either the objectives or legal powers to do something isn't doing that thing, because it obviously won't. In terms of the number of times that a body is seen, whether that's success or failure, it might be neither, in the sense that it sometimes reflects the level of interest that parliamentarians have. And that doesn't necessarily correlate with the importance of the individual industries and regulators. It might correlate with their backgrounds, or it might correlate with what's been brought to them. Clearly, if something's going badly wrong in an industry, the regulator is going to be seen more. But it might also be seen more if as in some cases, the regulator itself is proactive and is trying to be scrutinised and to put itself in front of Parliament, and some do that. But yeah, if a regulator's been seeing a lot, that's usually a symptom that there's a lot of interest from Parliament, which could be a combination of it's just an area ministers are interested in, plus there's potentially a problem. How to put consumers first? That's a whole other question. I think and there's debate around that as to the role of ombuds, also the roles of sort of consumer champions or statutory consumer groups in informing the strategy of regulators and the development of regulation. So I think there is a piece of work that I haven't done that one could do about trying to strengthen some of those bodies, because I think you do find, setting aside the individual redress arena, when you're looking at, well, who is influential over MPs or over regulators, often there may be trade bodies that are quite well funded and resourced to influence the discussions that take place. But then if you look at the sort of consumer landscape, you have some very good organizations like Which or Sisters Advice who do very good work, but it's not as institutionalized as it is on the other side. So there's certainly an imbalance there. But the question is, should government be stepping in to either give those bodies more powers or more resource? And if so, what does that look like? And what might be some of the consequences of that? But it's a very good question.
Thank you, Matthew. And thank you again, Barry. Folks, please do feel free to put your hand up if you'd like to come in with a comment or a question. Whilst we're waiting for that, I'm going to share my screen again because I'm very pleased to say that Treasury committees or work and pensions committees, they can be quite responsive. Transparency Task Force, I'm very proud to say actually, has initiated 3 parliamentary inquiries, 2 with the Work and Pensions Committee. The first of those was about the topic of the need for greater transparency on costs and charges in the world of pensions and investments. And that was a good inquiry. We participated in that directly, we gave evidence, and it led to a report being published that increased pressure for the need for greater transparency on costs and charges in pensions and investments. And then when Sir Stephen Timms was the chair, we wrote to him asking for an inquiry to be open on pension scams. What more could and should be done to protect people who were at risk of becoming a victim of pension scams, and what more could and should be done to help people who became victims. And again, another good inquiry that we were able to initiate and give evidence to, as of course did many, many others. I'm going to share my screen again because in some ways, one of the things I'm particularly proud of in terms of what TTF has managed to do over the years is what I'm about to show you. So this is the letter that we wrote Harriet Baldwin back in March 2023. Harriet Baldwin MP at the time was the chair of the Treasury Committee. And what the letter basically says is, dear chair of the Treasury Committee, for all these good reasons, can you please open an inquiry into SME finance? And we wanted that to happen for all kinds of reasons, but particularly because of something called the BBRS the Business Banking Resolution Service, which we perceived and still perceive to have been a complete failure. Very long story short, it was an entity to sort out compensation for victims of banking misconduct, people who were running businesses who were shortchanged by the banks in terms of the compensation. Very complicated story. And this thing called the Business Banking Resolution Service was set up, but unfortunately it was actually controlled by the banks. So we had the banks controlling the compensation to victims of banking misconduct. And we wanted this inquiry open to look into that. The letter was pretty good, obviously pretty evidence-based. And what we did to hopefully get the letter listened to is we got a whole bunch of organisations to be co-signatories. Obviously, there's us there, but organisations like the Federation of Small Business also co-signed it, as did others, an all-party parliamentary group there. In fact, there's 3 APPGs. We got all them to sort of, get on board with it. Various other people, including members of Parliament, we were particularly pleased with this. We wrote to all kinds of MPs, and we got our members to encourage them to write to their MPs saying, we want the Treasury Committee to open this inquiry. It would be a major social justice victory if it could happen, please. And we got all these politicians to co-sign the letter that was going to the Treasury Committee. So that was great. We were ever so pleased there. And also some members of the House of Lords, as you can see here. A few people from overseas, and then lots and lots of individuals. And when we published their names, we published them according to who their MP was. So, for example, Dennis Taylor was a constituent of Andy MacDonald MP, for example. That worked. So it resulted in the inquiry being opened. We got quite frustrated latterly because we weren't able to give evidence ourselves to that inquiry in any direct way. We did provide a written submission, but we weren't able to give evidence in person, which was a bit disappointing and frankly frustrating. So we're going to be trying again to get the new Treasury Committee to revisit some of those issues. My point being basically that based on our experience, you can influence the agenda. You can actively campaign to ask the committee to cover this topic or this topic. And sometimes you get lucky. And if you get enough support and if you write your letter well enough, you can get things to happen, which is actually pretty pleasing. And I should say that there definitely have been some absolutely superb chairs of parliamentary committees. Big fan of people like Sir Stephen Timms and Lord Tyree and others in the old days when the Treasury Committee seemed to have a bit more teeth than it has more recently. But the early signs of Meg Hillier MP, Dame Meg Hillier, to my mind, are really encouraging. It's obviously a pretty new Treasury Committee, and I think the new committee perhaps more robust, if I can put it that way, than the old one. I think Philip was right earlier when he said that having the right people doing the job, people who are pretty high on integrity and fortitude is absolutely significant. We'll go to Mark Bannister in a moment, but before we do, I'll bounce back just to Matthew to see if Matthew wants to share any thoughts in light of what I've said or anything else that's come to mind. Matthew, back to you.
I mean, only just to say that that's really quite impressive in terms of the breadth of coalition you've put together to make that happen. That's a lot of sort of influential signatories on that letter, and yeah, I mean, in the end, these committees the secretariats are quite small. Committee members, particularly, will come in. And they may not have a formed view, particularly at the start of their terms in these committees, as to what their agenda is. That might firm up as time goes on. But yeah, you can catch them at a point where they haven't decided their program, or they might have a gap and be looking for something to take on. And that is the flip side of some of the reactive emphasis, is that they do have the capacity and the interest to react to problems that happen on the ground that are brought to their attention. So yeah, I would agree.
Thank you very much. We're going to go to Mark Bannister, then we'll go to any other sort of final comments from folks. We'll then go back to Matthew for his final word before we wrap up by 7:30 in roughly 10 minutes or so time. Thank you, Matthew. It's been great. It's been really great. Mr. Mark Bannister, please take yourself off mute and share your thoughts. I always listen very attentively to what Mark says. There's a lot of thought behind it very frequently. Thank you, Mark. Thank you.
Here goes. I hope I'm not going to disappoint. Matthew, thank you very much for your exposition and your very fine presentation of points, which I will look forward to reviewing on the replay. Sorry, I was out walking the dogs when you started and I was a little late entering the meeting, but nonetheless, I got the gist of it. However, I'm afraid I'm going to spoil the party and be a bit critical, mainly because I want you to be better.
Right.
And I feel the need, and that's not directed at you personally, but it is directed at your institute. And I was just casting around quickly on your website, and I thought to myself, what a wonderful character full of wonderfully charming, excellently qualified insiders. Oh dear, this isn't going to take us very far. I don't see it full of rebels. I don't see it full of challenge. I don't see a broad cross-section of society. I see government, ex-government, business leaders, all those usual faces. None of the people whose lives have been turned upside down and it's gone wrong. Where are they, Matthew? Why? What possible good are you going to do having more of the same? And the answer is well known to us all. None, none, none. And I say this because we learn from, or we should learn from what's gone wrong, but we don't. We're English. We do it. We've been doing this for centuries, right? This is what makes us so mediocre. We used to be great, but we're not anymore. And we could be. We could be excellent. We could be phenomenal. But to be phenomenal, you have to have, at best, rapid evolutionary change and more likely some revolutionary change. And I looked across your institute and it's not there. And it's not there in government. And I listened to your presentation and it's excellent. Don't detract from what you've done, but it doesn't fill me with any hope whatsoever. You will make the same presentation at the end of this parliament, whether it lasts the full term or not, we're yet to see, but assuming it does. And substantively, I predict it will show little or no change. And that's not good enough. We have failure after failure after failure across all sorts of areas of government. And yet we haven't put in place any of the mechanisms necessary to effect change. If this was a business that had to run as a business, it wouldn't be, because it would have been bankrupt years ago. Okay, both fiscally, intellectually, morally, spiritually, the whole gamut, right? And I hope that you're scribbling some notes as I look at you, Matthew, but because you really need to, because if you can bring those things forward and say to yourselves, right, we're going to tell government that we can't have more of this, we've got to do something different, then we'll get somewhere. Short of that, no chance. My MP is a minister. Useless, because she don't want to upset her career. She's in it for herself. And I'm speaking about you, Laura. Laura Trott is her name. And she's charming and lovely and gorgeous. And she puts out all the right PR. And when you come to a really sticky testing subject, not so much. And I'm afraid that we're full of testing tricky subjects and we need to address them.
Mark, thank you. If we think about what Mark just explained, and Mark, thank you for sharing your thoughts so candidly as you often do, and it's always very thought-provoking, and it's always very, very well meant, and it's genuinely very progressive, because it kind of often takes us to the tricky, challenging bit, and you're very good at doing that, Mark. If you think about what Mark has just said in the context of, for example, I'm speaking to everybody here, not just Mark or Matthew, but if we think about things like Hillsborough, contaminated blood, if we think about Grenfell, if we think about the post office scandal, the thing to do with people in the war who were exposed deliberately, it seems, to radiation testing, there's a long list of horrible things that have happened that we don't really seem to have learnt from because they keep happening again. There was a lot of conversation about a duty of candor, this kind of requirement for institutions in government to actually tell the truth quickly, and to have a legal responsibility to do so. Do you, let me rephrase what Marcus said in a way. Do you find it easy to understand, Matthew, when people like Mark and others are frequently very disappointed with the, for want of a better phrase, the overall hierarchy of oversight, getting our regulators and statutory bodies to do a decent and better job? Is that something you can relate to? Allow me to frame it in that way, Matthew.
I mean, completely. But it's also frustrating because it is not something that I can single-handedly change.
Of course.
Nor I fear is it something that anybody can single-handedly change. And some of the frustration you get from politicians, I think, like, when they want another bonfire of the Crown goes or whatever, is because they feel like they cannot control the system to the degree they want. I think the government at the moment is frustrated that the state is not responsive to political steers in the way that they want it to be. And so, and I'm torn on that because on the one hand, I want institutions to be accountable. On the other hand, I want our democracy to be able to operate a very complex system, to be able to plan for the very long term. And all of that does require some things being at an arm's length and operating with a degree of independence. And there is a tension and a friction in that, and that is hard to resolve. It's not that I think that sits easily, but I think that designing a system in which there is no friction of that kind is really difficult. I mean, to talk about the IFG specifically, it is always a dilemma for us as to what extent we use our public voice to achieve influence versus using our credibility with stakeholders to participate in their conversations, which sometimes happens more privately. And different think tanks put themselves in different places along that continuum. And it would be very difficult for us, I think, to be trusted by all participants if we were very direct and very forthright in response to everything that happened on a day-to-day basis. And different members of the institute operate differently. It's a debate that we have about what our role
Matthew,
is.
can I respond to quickly and cut
Yeah.
across you?
Mm.
In saying what I'm saying, I'm not directing you as to how you go about it. I'm saying, I'm talking about the need for it, right? And you've got to have a cross-section of voices and people being heard and listened to. And Andy is charming and very nice. I'm a little more aggressive. The reality of this is, however, that you've got to bite the bullet. Occasionally you go into the doctor's office and he's got bad news for you. There is bad news. You're going to have to take these pills and it may not be a good outcome. Okay. Or you've got to have an operation you don't want. Okay. But we never get that in government. And until we do, and that starts happening, yeah, your ministers are going to be frustrated and your government's going to be frustrated. And as I said, we're going to have more and more of the same. We've got to stop, thinking that we can all have a wonderful love-in. I'm afraid that's just not on the cards. Sometimes you've got to have people fired and you've got to do so publicly. And, as regards the FSA and which I see is where you were, along with the Bank of England and all the rest of it. So I'm afraid you're a consummate insider. Congratulations. But, no, thank you. And I don't mean that personally rude to you. But again, the reality is the FCA goes in front of the Treasury Select Committee and it lies its backside off, right? And all of us, or a good number of us on this call, know that for a fact. right? These MPs need to absolutely fire one of their arses, to put it in the vernacular, all right? And in that moment, all will change, because suddenly all of these people will realize they're vulnerable. They need to be, Nicol Rathy needs to be fired. He needs to come before and not sit there and sugarcoat all of this thing. He needs to be fired publicly, right? Because he's been lying and telling untruths for years on in those forums. Okay. And when somebody does that and causes a complete rumpus, all will change. Again, when these MPs have these people, they should call the sergeant of arms and say, right, you can spend the next 24 hours having free board and lodging, courtesy of Parliament, and see what happens. They'll be on the 10 o'clock news. They'll be on the Radio 4 in the morning Today program and everybody else. But guess what? Stuff will happen. And if the government's frustrated, it'll be a lot less frustrated afterwards, because people will fear it. I used to fear every day whether I would have a job in the evening, because I had to perform every single day. I've spent my life performing, whether it's for myself or my employers, right? But none of these characters do. Sorry, I've gone on and on, but I think you'll find that we're a ready audience for this on this call. I'll end.
Mark, you have made the point. You've made it very, very powerfully. Obviously, no one here is expecting Matthew to be able to wave a magic wand and sort all these issues out. But I think if I kind of frame what Mark has said in a different way, I think I would frame it as saying that if you're going to provide, and this is not about the Institute for Government, but very, very generally, if there's going to be accountability and scrutiny, it's got to be from an entity or entities that are sufficiently happy to have a bit of a scrap from time to time, to stick up for what needs to be stuck up for. And if there's too much schmoozing, for want of a better word, you never get that kind of force for change. And maybe having organizations with more of a willingness to roll up their sleeves and get stuck in could have some value. We're going to go to Paul Callan in a moment, but I want to go back to Matthew just to share Matthew's thoughts, because Mark's raised some very interesting points. He's been very challenging. Obviously, he doesn't mean this at you personally, Matthew, or your organization, but he's somebody like many on these calls who has personally suffered as a direct consequence of what happens when things go horribly wrong. And there's been a lack of accountability and scrutiny and things being put right. Matthew, over to you before we go to Paul Callan, and then we'll start wrapping up. Matthew, thank you.
Thanks. I mean, all I think I can do is express a frustration that it is not possible for me to be as far into the particular question on if it's Nicol Rathy or whoever it is, as would be required to solve those problems. So, if somebody has, routinely lied to select committees, I think their position would be untenable. I am not in a position to say to what extent that is or isn't true about the current chief executive of the FCA. But so I hear the frustration. I'm not in a position where I can resolve it, and it's frustrating to me that I'm not in a position I can resolve it. But
I'm sorry, I'm going to cut in one more time.
Go on.
No, Mark, I've muted you, Mark, because I want to stick to the timescales. Okay, you've made some great input, Mark, already. Thank you very much. And obviously, Matthew's not in a position to comment on the Nicol Rathy situation particularly. So thank you, Mark, for allowing me just to mute you there. Let's go to Paul Callan. Mr. Paul Callan, please share your thoughts. It's coming up to 7:30, folks, so we need to be quite succinct. Thank you, Paul. Over to you.
Hi, Matthew, and thank you very much for the presentation. Going back to the duty of candour point that Andy raised, I wanted to first of all raise it in a slightly different way. I really like the idea of having a secretariat, and I think that there's a consensus amongst this group that people or representatives of regulators coming for select committees do have the ability to mislead, and in many of our experiences do mislead. And I think that perhaps it should be the job of the Secretariat to ensure that that doesn't happen. And if there was a duty of candour, and that it was the duty of people coming before the select committees on behalf of regulators to tell the truth and not mislead, and for them to potentially face contempt or another form of prosecution or another form of offence, I think that would really focus people. And I think that there's perhaps something that could be done there, just to change the attitude of people coming before select committees. But in relation to regulation more widely, what I would say is, first of all, do we have too many regulators, particularly in the professional services arena? And is the model that we use currently fit for purpose? When we regulate in a criminal context, we have the police, we have the CPS, and then we have an independent body, i.e. the courts, that acts as judge and jury on that. In a regulatory context, as we see from the Post Office, we have investigator prosecutor models on a regular basis. For the likes of the SRA and certain other regulators, there's also an investigator prosecutor judge and jury model that's in operation. So, is that really fit for purpose in the modern world?
What would you say is an alternative, Paul, just before we go to Matthew? If that's not the model, what do you think might be?
Well, I think that there was a reason that we separated these different functions to police the public, for want of a better expression, and in a criminal context, I should say. And is it not better to have an investigatory body, a prosecutory body, and then a separate tribunal stroke court system? I personally am all in favour of certain effective tribunal bodies staying in place, but I do fear, particularly, it will be very interesting to see what comes out in the Post Office inquiry, but I do fear that the current model is not necessarily fit for purpose, and it's also very difficult to scrutinise.
Well, thank you. Matthew, your thoughts on that, and any other final comments before we bring our conversation to a close? Matthew. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Paul. I mean, I think on the duty of candour point, that's really interesting. It's and should be thought about very seriously. I think what's disappointing is that the experience of people on this call suggests that it may be necessary. It shouldn't be, and particularly when people are giving evidence to Parliament, one should be able to take candour for granted. Are there too many regulators, and is the structure too complicated? That's something I think that the government's quite keen to look at. So certainly the thing they published yesterday is already looking at some areas where they can consolidate regulators and bring functions together. So far, the attempts to do that are fairly modest structurally. I think that's right. And the reason I think that is because we've done some research on establishing and abolishing public bodies. And while the effectiveness in terms of how functions change when doing those things is quite variable, the absolute certainty is that it will take a lot of time, a lot of management attention, a lot of resource in the process of making those changes. So a structural reorganization needs to be thought about really carefully, case by case, to see, is it actually going to make things better? If it's not, your default should always be to not doing it, because it's quite disruptive. And so you have industries like, we had a public event here on Monday about the insourcing of the probation service. And we're hearing that people who work in the probation service are still scarred from the outsourcing of the probation service 10 years ago. And so these kind of institutional changes sit with people over their careers. And so in the point in time you come in and think, let's restructure this area, you're often doing it to people who've been restructured 3 or 4 times already. And so the continuity and the attention to the actual functions and how things are working is really, really important.
Matthew, thank you very much indeed. Mark's put a lovely little note in the chat there. He's simply re-emphasising his point about there being need for change, which we all understand. We all understand. No, I guess in the case of, is there any capacity for structural change that's quite quick? I'm personally, I'm pretty open to that because I think there's a lot wrong in the system. But if you do go down the kind of revolutionary, big, fast structural change, there could be a lot of mess, a lot of blood on the carpet, so to speak, metaphorically speaking. You know, if folks in the UK started to do an Elon, if I can put it that way, started to do an Elon and started taking a chainsaw to our institutions, it could turn out to be absolutely brilliant, or it could turn out to be a complete nightmare that will take, you know, decades to recover from. So really open-minded about the pace of change, as long as it's in the right direction. Some of the commentary tonight has been about, I'll come back to you for your final thoughts in just a moment, Matthew. Some of the commentary tonight has been about integrity and honesty and lies and deception and that kind of thing. I do believe, this is a very, very genuine comment, I do believe there's real reason for concern about some of that. There's stuff that we've witnessed that does cause one to believe that there hasn't always been honesty in front of Treasury committees, and that's a real concern. That's a real concern. We don't necessarily know what to do about it. Maybe that's Matthew. So that's something we can chat about another time. Matthew, back to you for your final comments. Then we'll wrap up. Thank you, Matthew.
Yeah, I mean, on the subject of structural change, I think the points that have come up about, you know, consumer or citizen representation on boards, or the way in which decisions are made by these bodies or redress, some of that area is really quite interesting. I also think, you know, there's a place for professional standards possibly in some of this. So there's an organization I'm involved with called the Institute of Regulation, which is trying to create a peer group of regulators to try and, if you like, professionalize regulation. And so if you get to a point where regulation is deemed a professional activity and is held to standards of integrity that are specific to itself, in the way that, you know, if you had a chartered accountant or a qualified solicitor acting, they would have certain professional responsibilities to do things. That might be another route towards getting a particular kind of accountability to as to the way in which those individuals specifically present themselves. But I fear that in the case of select committees, it's not their responsibilities as regulator that matters. It's their sort of integrity as leaders or as public appointees leading public bodies. And so you go back to sort of almost the Nolan principles of public life and the sort of outgrowth of that those political appointees are supposed to adhere to, and whether those codes of conduct that apply to them are being adhered to adequately. But yeah, so I'm not sure. I don't have an answer. But this has been a really stimulating, interesting, challenging conversation about some of these issues, and I very much appreciate the input everybody's made and hearing your perspectives. It's a complicated problem, and it's got more complicated. And I certainly will be thinking a lot more about this conversation. So thank you all very, very much.
Matthew, you're a gentleman. Thank you very much for responding the way you have. Sometimes the best conversations are the ones that cause you to scratch your head, and I'm scratching my head all the time about so many things. Matthew, thank you very much. We really do appreciate you spending your time with us this evening. Let's also show our appreciation to Matthew. There's a couple of specific thoughts that have come off the back of this conversation, Matthew, that I'll follow up you with. There's a couple of ideas. And there's a pensions lawyer called Robin Ellenson who could be a perfect person for you to speak to about the idea of professionalising and qualifications around regulation. But I'll cover that off separately. Okay. Thank you very much, Matthew.
Thank you.
Good evening,
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, everybody.
Good evening. Thank you. Bye bye. Bye bye.
Good night. Bye.
Good night. Thank you.